Today, we're talking about Tulips by Sylvia Plath, its meaning, etc. But first, a reading. Tulips. The tulips are too excitable. It is winter here. Look how white everything is, how quiet, how snowed in. I am learning peacefulness, lying by myself quietly as the light lies on these white walls, this bed, these hands. I am nobody. I have nothing to do with explosions. I've given my name and my day clothes up to the nurses, and my history to the anesthetists, and my body to the surgeons. They have propped my head between the pillow and the sheet cuff, like an eye between two white lids that will not shut. Stupid pupil. It has to take everything in. The nurses pass and pass. They are no trouble. They pass the way gulls pass inland in their white caps, doing things with their hands, one just the same as another, so it is impossible to tell how many there are. My body is a pebble to them. They tend it as water tends to the pebbles it must run over, smoothing them gently. They bring me numbness in their bright needles. They bring me sleep. Now I have lost myself. I am sick of baggage. My patent leather overnight case like a black pillbox. My husband and child smiling out of the family photo. Their smiles catch onto my skin, little smiling hooks. I have let things slip. A 30-year-old cargo boat, stubbornly hanging onto my name and address. They have swabbed me clear of my loving associations. Scared and bare on the green plastic pillow trolley, I watched my tease-it, my bureaus of linen, my books, sink out of sight, and the water went over my head. I am a nun now. I have never been so pure. I don't want any flowers. I only wanted to lie with my hands turned up and be utterly empty. How free it is. You have no idea how free. The peacefulness is so big it dazes you. And it asks nothing. A name tag. A few trinkets. It is what the dead close on, finally. I imagine them shutting their mouths on it like a communion tablet. The tulips are too red in the first place. They hurt me. Even through the gift paper, I can hear them breathe lightly, through their white swaddlings like an awful baby. Their redness talks to my wound. It corresponds. They are subtle. They seem to float, though they weigh me down, upsetting me with their sudden tongues and their color, a dozen red lead sinkers round my neck. Nobody watched me before. Now I am watched. The tulips turn to me, and the window behind me, where once a day the light slowly widens and slowly thins, and I see myself, flat, ridiculous, a cut paper shadow between the eye of the sun and the eyes of the tulips. And I have no face. I have wanted to efface myself. The vivid tulips eat my oxygen. Before they came, the air was calm enough, coming and going, breath by breath, without any fuss. Then the tulips filled it up, like a loud noise. Now the air snags and eddies round them the way a river snags and eddies round a sunken rust-red engine. They concentrate my attention, that was happy, playing and resting without committing itself. The walls also seem to be warming themselves. The tulips should be behind bars, like dangerous animals. They are opening like the mouth of some great African cat, and I am aware of my heart. It opens and closes its bowl of red blooms out of sheer love of me. The water I taste is warm and salt, like the sea, and comes from a country far away as health. So Tulips by Sylvia Plath is an interesting poem. I don't know how you guys reacted to it, but for me, this is one when I'm reading it, I'm kind of curious about this person. Right? And I'm also concerned. To me, when I read this, there's where there ought to be anxiety. I almost feel that there's a feeling of relief, that anxiety is fading away. Maybe that's controversial and let's get into it. But that's my initial reactions to maybe what this narrator's going through.
So you're telling me we're another poem here about flowers, and you're more interested in the person than the flowers? Who are you, and what have you done with my Una?
I know I always tend to go towards the flower analysis, but there's something about the way this poem kind of opens, right? You have white mentioned twice. We're in winter, and you're like, ugh, why is this flower invading? Almost, right? It's winter. It's, tulips are supposed to be kind of like a March to May bloom, couple week flower, right? So it's almost like here's this thing that's out of place and it's ruining this beautiful, pristine evenness of everything else is where my mind initially goes to with this opening stanza.
Yeah, so it's marred the situation is what it has done. And I think that it's interesting that you take what most people would assume is something beautiful like a flower, and a flower that's blooming in winter is even more rare, and she's almost using it to a negative connotation. And you mentioned that white is used several times. So is quiet. So it's setting a tone here of that everything is quiet, kind of surreal, and everything is white and perfect. And then there's this, there's this air, there's this glitch that she's honed in on. And I think that's what she's kind of channeling her frustration through.
Do you think she sees herself as the tulip? Like the tulip is to this scene as she is to society, to kind of cut to the chase a little bit?
Maybe she thinks she is the quiet white snow of the situation. And what has happened to her is she's had surgery, had an appendectomy, and that is the tulip. That's the invasion that broke her.
There's something interesting about this first stanza, the last two lines. I have given my name and my day clothes up to the nurses and my history to the anesthetist and my body to the surgeons. When we talk about clothes, those tend to be like how I can like outwardly manifest like my interest, myself, my being, and my name, my memories, right? Like my history. Well, those are something that, who I was 10 years ago, what I looked like 10 years ago, the grays on my face, the fat around my belly, how I've changed in terms of what I've learned, in terms of wisdom, the pain that I now feel in my joints from arthritis setting in. I'm not the same person I was 30 years ago. I'm much different. But I've got the same memories, right? Like those memories are something about what's connecting me, Una, throughout all these years. And the way that she's just willingly giving up on those things, like it almost felt like relief for her to return to nothingness, that is a blessing to her, as opposed to having to fit into society, how to be that white blanket so that you're not standing out like you're being that tulip. To me, there's something peaceful in this narrator's eyes about the nihilism of nothingness, about how nothing matters and it's good to stop having to live up and put up false fronts for other people is how I kind of read it.
Yeah, this is the great thing about poetry is it's so interpretive. I think that for me at the end of this first stanza, I thought about it of she is not happy with this situation, that she's been stripped raw, that everything is, her name has been taken, her history's been taken, even her clothes have been taken. I guessing that was like her small clothes, like her undergarments. They called them day clothes, I think, back then. And that they've even, cut open her body. So like she has nothing left that's herself, that she's given everything over to these people. And what does she have to show for it? That she is no longer like, maybe her skin is the white, and, like porcelain, and now it's been marred. That's the scar that she's going to have to carry around for the rest of her life. That is going to be a reminder of this very, I think, invasive procedure that she didn't want, that she was forced upon to save her life. And to your point, maybe she didn't want her life saved. Maybe this was, something that was kind of against her will because she really didn't have a choice in the matter.
To your point, that control, the idea of choice and fate, right? She doesn't surrender her name, her history. She gives it, which, when I think of the word give, I think of something voluntary, like it's a choice almost, right? And the way that like she talks about how her eyes are forced to take in things like stupid pupil, which, a lot of people talk about like, well, the pupil could be a play on words, right? It could be pupil as an eye being forced to input information about the world, or it could be pupil, like you're forced to always learn and take on the world, take on its learnings, because like if you want to fit in with like that white blanket of snow, you gotta you got to almost have like that No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai problem of how do you fit in? How do you put on that mask and fake being the same almost as everyone else? And it's like you're forced to do that. Otherwise, you're the tulip that stands out. And like the word choice of like, she's not surrendering, she's not forced to do it. It's like a choice to her almost.
Definitely a choice. And I think that as we lead into that second stanza and talk about the eye of the choices that she's going to ultimately control her life, I think that the poem is really speaking about Plath, and that is coming through here of hers, ultimate demise of, taking her own life, that this is maybe one of those crucial moments in life where she starts thinking about, I need to have control over myself because I've given so much away. Now is time I take back that power.
Do you think, like when she's like looking out the door and you see the nurses just washing by and there's beautiful imagery about how like water rushes past a pebble, right? And then that wears down the pebble, which could be a person being worn down by society, by life. Even to your point, earlier you were saying that she felt kind of exhausted, right? Do you think she wants to fit in to that flow? Do you think she wants to be a part of things like returning to life? That is this a gift or is this a curse almost?
No, it definitely doesn't want to return. And the other part of that stanza is the one with her children, little smiling hooks of her husband and her child of, ugh, when I get out of here, I got to go back. And it's just like they're digging into me and pulling me away. And that's like gutting, pun intended, that this is how she feels about people that love her and that she probably loves as well, is that it isn't positive. It's not a good reinforcement. It's something that she feels that obligation and again makes her feel powerless.
Right. And I think they even mentioned in that line that says that the husband and child are smiling out. Like it doesn't say they're happy. It doesn't say they are smiling. It says they're smiling out, right? It's almost like putting on that performance in a sense. And I think you're right. There's confliction there where I think smiling hooks, right? To your point, it's smiling. That's good. She probably does care about them on various levels. And in some ways does tether her to the world in some regards. But exactly to your point, they're hooks. Hooks ain't good things. They don't feel good when you get hooked usually.
No. And it's kind of interesting how the poem seems to go into this kind of rhythm, like waves up and down. And as we move further into the poem, then we get the boat, the cargo ship. And again, something referencing water. We have water referenced many times throughout here. Now we're on a boat on water. And, what is this, having to do with her life going up and down? And as you read through the poem in its entirety, it's choppy. That it sometimes you feel like the sentence shouldn't have ended, and other times it feels like there's two sentences that are crammed together. And I think that's a lot, maybe for like an allegory of her life, of sometimes it felt like things were chopped, and then other things where she was like, is this ever going to end? It just kept going and going. And that's really kind of how I felt. And you'd mentioned at the beginning of this poem did give me a lot of anxiety. Because as I was reading, I'm like, the history/English teacher in me is like, this is like so quote poorly written, but it's supposed to make you feel that way because that's sometimes how life makes you feel.
Okay. For me, this was just like, like you said, it's very subjective. It was so beautiful and enrapturing to me that I did not have that issue at all. I really thought that this was just so well crafted. When you think about like you're talking about like with the sea, how that comes up multiple times, the imagery, and a lot of times oceans and crossing oceans, we've talked about before, can kind of represent chaos. It represents big change. Like when we think back to 18th century, even 19th century to some regards, crossing the ocean was life-changing, and typically you didn't come back. It was something that when you crossed water, it was like rebirth in a sense, right? To even going back to biblical times and stuff like that. So it's like, to me, there's a line in here that kind of spoke to me about that. It says, I didn't want any flowers. I only wanted to lie with my hands turned up and be utterly empty. And she's not saying my hands are empty. She's saying be utterly empty, right? Like there's a nihilistic view from this narrator that I'm not a nihilist. Like I get it. Like I have different views, but there's something about her that like it made me kind of, I don't know why, it just made me sympathize with her. Maybe I wanted her to be with her family, and that which says more about me than anything. But the way that the words like just flowed together, yes, it breaks traditional sentence structure. But to me, like when you kind of like get it into that poetry rhythm, you can see why she was doing it and why she put things a certain way. And it's like you said, it kind of put me on the boat where I'm rocking with the poetry. And at the same time, I'm letting go of meaning. I was almost like taking on nihilism in some regards too, as I read this, because like I started to feel for her, because she says, I didn't want the tulips, right? She wanted to reject everything that society said she should value, right? She wanted to create her own value. And for her, I think she struggled with what is that? She just became an empty nothingness shell, which is very anxiety inducing. I agree.
Yeah. The flow of the poem, very, very good there of you. I see what you did. So I feel as we move through the journey, as we go across the water that you can't return from, she's looking at the end of the journey. And then we come back to the name sake of the story, the poem, the tulips. And we move back into what do the tulips truly mean? And there's some very graphic imagery. And I thought one of the most heartbreaking part of the poem is that a dozen red lead sinkers round my neck. And it's just like you can imagine that that something so beautiful is weighing her down. Family beautiful, her child beautiful, her love, her marriage, life beautiful. And she's seeing this as a negative, that it's pulling her down, and it's got to be exhausting, and I think that this is a perfect representation of beautiful being what somebody that has true chronic depression, debilitating depression, sees something beautiful in such a negative manner.
Yeah. Well, and even just the writing, right? The red lead, like the way that the rhymes and the alliteration happen in this with the imagery, it's a very engrossing poem. But to your point, it's haunting in some regards, because while I think, if I'm putting in her shoes, she views it as freeing. The tulips like literally are like described as cannibalizing her own oxygen, right? Like it's stealing life from her. And to your point, while family, a lot of people will say is beautiful, they also take from you. You give for the next generation. You sacrifice to the point where like you start to lose that identity. You start to lose who you are. You give up your history, or your history gets tied up with someone else. And you lose where the self and others meet sometime, particularly when you're sacrificing a lot for your family, right? So at the same time, I fully get that feeling of a smiling hook, of it's beautiful, but there's also that pain and that sacrifice that goes with it, which you can romanticize and say it's great and it's wonderful, and it is. But some people can also feel that pain a little bit, or don't get as much on the positive as the outside. And I think this woman is suffering and maybe even feeling guilty from that in some regards.
Definitely feeling guilty. I definitely feel trapped is a great word. And I think that a lot of us and sympathize with that. I think that's why this poem speaks to so many, why it's so famous and so regarded and well taught. There's so many different avenues you can talk about the poem in just a educational sense as well, with, the juxtaposition and the alliteration and the metaphors, but it's relatable. Maybe not as a younger person. I know, and I'm speaking for me personally, I didn't read this as a teenager in high school. I'm sure it's very well used in schools across the nation. But I know that if my teacher had me read this at 14, 15, 16, right over the head, it would have been a prime example of why I struggled / did not like poetry as a young individual, a young reader. I think you need to have some miles on you. I think you need to have a little bit of gray hair, some, lines on your face before you can maybe truly appreciate what she's going through. That you love family, but sometimes it can feel like a burden. You have to provide for them, or you have to love them, and you put them first before your own needs. And that's something that you truly don't see maybe until you are a parent or a grandparent, or you've just, lived your life as, a spouse or whatever. And I think that this personifies what it means to truly give up And sometimes you have nothing left to give. And it's just, you're at the point of saying, hey, I'm done. And that's ultimately, I kind of feel what happens. It's very, very heartbreaking, but it hits to your heart. And I think that ultimately it's relatable.
I would say that there's a lot of different walks of life, and some kids don't have it as easy as others. And they might experience kind of a harsh life to the point where they might have gray hairs, even at a young age, to put it. That some people, if we compare it to, remember the story Eveline by James Joyce?
Oh, yeah.
You had a young girl that was put in a very hard situation because of her family. She had the opportunity to change that, right? And the question of should she or should she not change that is a hard thing that I think a lot of young people go through, right? And a lot of young people might face, not all, but some might face hardships as well, in the same way that this narrator might be facing hardships. And they're struggling with like that need to put on the face, to smile out from photos, versus maybe not having a purpose yet, that nothingism, the nihilism is consuming them. And it can be very anxiety inducing. And this can help them feel seen in some regards too. And hopefully you make good decisions and can come out to say, where are my next steps? Where are the things that are important to me? And how do we appreciate those? How do we turn those around into something more positive? That I think there's definitely purposes and tools to literature. And this is one where it's almost just useful just to see yourself sometimes. And for me, like if you feel yourself kind of like resonating, if you're one of those people that sees yourself in that narrator, I'm having sympathy for this person, right? Like I won't be the only person in the world that might want to like help or to give meaning to a person who is struggling with that anxiety in a sense.
And in life, we all get hurt at different degrees at different times. And if you're a young person that's been through a lot of trauma, then this is going to speak to you more, and you're going to understand, what does it mean that I can finally be free of whatever traumatic event, you've been through in your life. And again, like me as a young man, a young teenager, maybe I hadn't been through that much until my late teens and early teens. And then, I went through something, and then I went through something, and then my family went through something together. And then this becomes, more relatable. But wherever you're at, I think that you're going to be able to pick out pieces of this story that you can understand of, wow, this is impactful, and this is my life. How much control over it do I have?
Thank you for spending time with us. My name's been Una. We're going to leave a Sylvia Plath playlist down below. If you enjoyed the conversation, please leave a little flower emoji. It helps the channel out. Even if you don't know how to add to the conversation, it lets the ever-hungry YouTube algorithm know that you did enjoy it. Thank you for spending time with us. Peace.
Peace.